I think I'm set up pretty perfectly to talk about kind of the persistence of these behavioral changes and the behavioral wedges that we're talking about. Oh, I do need this. That we've been talking about today. And I think that persistence is something, I guess before I start, to say that Beth and I have been working on this for a long time together. So this is definitely a kind of a co-authorship, but I'm gonna take this one on and talk about it. But I think that looking at persistence is something that we don't necessarily do a lot of when we're looking at behavior change campaigns. Often, I'd like to think it's structurally because of funding periods. It's that people are funded to do campaigns, not necessarily look at those kind of advanced stages of what's happening in the end, or they need to get those results out. And so we kind of don't know the overall impact that we're having and the persistence of people doing these great behaviors that we have seen amazing results coming from that have been presented earlier today. But we need to know those persistent, if those changes that we're making are persistent and the factors that lead to persistence of behavior change to ensure, I mean, it's a lot like us looking at energy yesterday to ensure that our return on investment, so that our energy input into changing these behaviors is actually having an energy output into the future. And so, I mean, how do we ensure that, and how do we ensure that these aren't just merely the blip on the graph of people working in behavior changes and then they drop off right after we turn our backs, is a really important question. I wish that I had answers for you. I'm kind of in the hypothesis kind of theme of the day of maybe this is a framework by which we can examine looking at persistence, and that when you are all doing great things to change behaviors, A, think about the persistence of those behaviors, but B, maybe this is a good way for you to think about the kind of impacts that we can have. So to get started today, we know a lot about behavior change. I'm going to go through those slides pretty quickly and talk about the theories behind some of the campaigns that we've done at the University of Toronto that I'll focus on a bit later, and then I'll talk about kind of two distinct ideas of persistence and how they're important to us. So to start with, we have learned that the campaigns that rely on information alone aren't effective, and that something that we have to look at as well is how do we form habits, and what does habit formation require? And one of the things that it requires is a shift in the environment, or some kind of broad-scale environmental change. And I mean environment as in the room you live in, or your commute to work, moving, to recalibrate those kind of behavioral scripts that we have that are often unconscious. We don't really know why we just grab the car keys on the way out the door. We just do it because we've been doing it for a long time. So changing behavior is easiest when you have kind of an environmental change. But if a large-scale context change isn't possible, there are other elements that we've kind of pieced together to create behavior change. And the strategies, I'm going to talk about those strategies in a bit. I'm sure a lot of you have quite a bit of familiarity with them. So, so the other things that are important is, the first point of this is what Beth is talking about, is that even when we do alter a building, or if we do move, that's such a perfect opportunity to change behaviors, but it really does need kind of that behavioral component to add on, rather than just moving a person into a green building. We need to kind of have that added behavioral element. And then the other idea is that potentially a focus on value change instead of strictly behavior change can have an increased impact both through time and across behaviors. And so that's the kind of idea that I'd like to talk about today, and the framework through which we should be looking at persistence is that both persistence, so the same behavior throughout time, is important, but also proliferation, so that initial behavior leads to other potentially higher impact behaviors down the road. And that those are two important things to be looking at kind of as we advance. So the hypothesis from that is that well, as it says, the behaviors that are likely to persist are, first of all, those ones that create new behavioral scripts, which are the kind of excellent example, and we all get really excited when we have those. I'm going to talk about the university context and when we have those. And then that we don't necessarily have to feel bummed out when we don't have one of those cases and we have to make behavior change through other means, because potentially the behaviors that we form through community-based social marketing, we're going to talk about temporal construal theory and all of these other things that we have in our toolkit, and a lot of you in the room know about, potentially those are getting into deeper kind of value shifts that lead more to proliferation, and that's a very important other part of persistence. So one of the ways that we've started to look at feedback and kind of that toolkit that I was talking about is the theory of temporal construal, and that's the idea that decisions about the distant future are based a little bit more on abstract values, and they're a little bit more optimistic. And so potentially we can tap into this optimism and abstract kind of values-based thinking that people have to shift their behaviors based on those and allow people to set goals and bring kind of these into their day-to-day. But then we have to be supporting them as the future becomes today and kind of convenience takes over and all of those other things. And the ways that we support them are largely outlined in things like community-based social marketing campaigns, where we have social norms that really allow for that support of remember when you thought that this was an important thing, as well as diminishing those barriers that may come up along the way, as well as prompts. And I mean, we heard a lot about feedback last night, and so the idea of feedback as well as a thing that can be used to help people remember their goals and optimism of the future as it becomes increasingly in the present. Okay, so I'm going to just talk a little bit about the campaigns that we've done at the University of Toronto. It's an important study to look at, I think because it is so big and because when you're looking at it, it's like a microcosm of a city. It's nice to study in that way. It is the City of Toronto's second largest landholder, and that we've been kind of using, piloting these strategies, community-based social marketing plus strategies in both offices and residences, as well as what I'm going to talk about right now, which is in our labs on campus. So this is the energy intensities on the campus of the University of Toronto, as I said, a giant campus. And what it's showing, these red spots are, I mean, you can just pick them all out. If you know the campus well, it's funny to look at this. I mean, funny in a sad way, but it's like, that's MedSci, that's Lash Miller Physical Laboratories, they're all labs. And why is that? That's because of fume hoods. And so the idea behind a fume hood is that they're great at keeping our researchers safe, but when not in use and being left open improperly, they use a huge, huge amount of energy, and we have to be really, really conscious of that. And so what we decided to do at the University of Toronto was to create a program, and these programs exist kind of across Canada and the United States. Harvard had a really great one as well. And so the goal of it was to minimize the airflow, and it had a dual ask, which is difficult for any program, I think, because it's a safety mechanism, and if people start using it improperly, then that's a problem. But so as low as possible, so keeping that sash as low as possible when not in use, so that not as much energy was being flushed out to be conditioned. And then the other was at a safe working height when in use. So it was kind of a dual safety, and we've talked a lot about that. How can health and environment be merged together? This is a pretty good example of that. This is kind of the idea of what was being used. So in terms of materials, there's stickers, reminders for the campaign for people, kind of typical prompt things, as well as people within the labs would go around, volunteers from the sustainability office would go around in the lab and put down stickers if people were compliant and measure the hoods, which is great for the data I'm about to show you, but also great though that data was put into a draw and people won things from the draw. So there's the kind of also just allowing people, giving people the information of where safe working height is. That's not always something that's completely clear or completely remembered to people. So allowing people to be able to see that was also really important to the campaigns. So it looks like a really perfect picture in a lot of ways. So before the campaign, I mean, the fume hoods are higher when they're not in use, I mean, only by a little bit, but, and then after the campaign, you're seeing that they're really, really a great reduction. So a success until I show you this, which is looking at after the campaign and then after campaign 2, so there were kind of 2 rounds of it. So we're seeing, looks like a great program on the surface, looks like a great program when it's running or directly after, but those gains dwindle and those behaviors are less persistent. So I mean, what this shows is that it both failed to change habits, so it failed to alter the environment enough to reprogram the people who use it, even though there was kind of a little bit of change in the environment by those things that were on the side. And also failed to meaningfully change kind of people's attitudes to allow it to persist or proliferate through time. And one of the reasons, I mean, we've talked a lot about why this would be. One of the reasons that we came up with was that there was that small incentive competitive element, and immediately that took away those kind of longer term values-based goals and made it, shortened up that timeline to getting that incentive, perfect, to getting that incentive, and made it kind of, brought it into the lower level construals and potentially therefore didn't tap into the broader values-based change that I'm talking about as being potentially where we find the best types of proliferation. That's kind of going exactly into why that was. There's also some anecdotal evidence from the people running the campaign that's further interesting is to note that labs that were most successful were those with a supportive lab organizer, so really speaking to kind of the social norms that are important in this. And then I'm doing some research right now looking at whether or not there's any clustering of where the most compliant were and whether or not if people beside you were compliant, you would also be compliant. So that isn't done yet, but I mean, would also be interesting to know if that kind of proximate social norm is important. Next, I'm going to go through Rewire. So Rewire is based in social marketing to enable participants to kind of internalize their behaviors and shift their attitudes in the process. It's been quite successful. Beth talked a bit about the one in residences. It's also been in offices. The office one has shifted into kind of more of a green ambassadors program now, but it's very much based in the kind of two-way flow of information and making sure that the solutions are specifically based to each office context, as well as that those social norms are quite developed within kind of that area, and that those social norms aren't prescribed to each office. Instead, they're kind of very much associated with the green ambassador within each office. And then in residences, and this is the perfect example of having a group of students moving into a new context, lots of them, this is their first time living on their own, and you kind of have the prime environment for being able to create new behaviors in them, and which is an amazing, amazing thing to be able to do, as well as being able to kind of have an inherently social structure in terms of a first-year class of students. It's a really great example, and we were pretty successful in this campaign as well, so an approximate kind of 10 to 13% reduction in that, and these are kind of the specific behaviors. And if you look through this list of specific behaviors, some of them are when you're actually telling somebody that they're allowed to do something that before they didn't know. So turning off lights in the bathroom, that's kind of a really easy win. There's quite a bit of change there, because really all you're doing is allowing people that kind of agency over a situation that before they didn't think they had control over. Thank you. Or turning lights off when leaving the common room is quite similar. And things like activating computers' energy efficiency savings. The reason why I do this research now is I was one of these representatives in my first year. And that one is particularly interesting because each person goes to each of the people that they are the representative of and helps you shift energy efficient, shift your computer settings. So that's something that not everybody knows how to do. They probably all got a brand new laptop for their first year, and they don't necessarily know how to do that. So being able to program that with people is a particularly important kind of way to allow for that uptake and a particularly social interaction that is persistent. I mean, unless they get annoyed when their screen goes off every 2 minutes, then it's particularly effective. So This is kind of a graph showing throughout the day reductions that we're seeing. The pilot is the black line, and then the post-pilot, which isn't a lot, like a long time after, is still kind of coasting below the pre-pilot line. So we're seeing a bit of persistence, but it's not kind of in the long term that we're looking for. So this is kind of how Rewire works, and it's really specifically based on social networks within residences. But kind of to go back up a little bit and think about what these 2 case studies and what those theories mean for persistence, and then we'll be able to talk about this, and I'd love to get your feedback and ideas on this, is that these are the kind of 2 ways to think of it. So first of all, taking advantage of a change in context can be used to develop new kind of persistent habits. And that these kind of campaigns at the University of Toronto led to a shift in attitudes, and we're not quite sure kind of, and resulted in these pro-environmental social norms, and they were supported by those through the process, but we're not necessarily sure of kind of their impact and persistence. And then the other is that behaviors, the idea of proliferation of behaviors, and are some behaviors a foot in the door tactic to further behaviors. And then I think that the other interesting point, the final interesting point, is looking at the relationships between the 2. We saw Beth's slide that said that behaviors lead to attitude change, leads to knowledge change, but does that only apply if those behaviors are mindful? So does it only apply if those behaviors are being led by some kind of shift in values or shift in attitudes? Well, I guess that's not how it happens, but if those behaviors are seeded in a way that people think about them regularly, or does that also apply for habitual behaviors? Because that's kind of where the interesting point in this is that potentially sometimes when we're creating habits that persist, although we're seeing behavior change, we might not be seeing that broader kind of attitude change. And so what are the interactions between those 2 is kind of a question that I'd love to talk about with you guys and look at more definitely in the future.